The center, all the faculty affiliated with the center, we explore the many creative ways in which media technologies interact with society, both how emerging media technologies transform society, but also the creative potential to develop new media technologies, and how this creativity can also emerge from the bottom up as like grassroots creativity with community engagement as well. Our particular strategic focus this year is to focus on AI as media, so not just as a tool to do things, but something that mediates society and our social relationships. So we explore how AI is a cultural and communicative forces that shapes creativity, knowledge production, and civic life, but also how it transforms urban spaces, storytelling, journalism, community engagement, and society. Here, if you're interested in what we do, there are several ways to be involved. This QR code takes us to our website, so you can check what we have, our events. Sign up to our newsletter. We have a newsletter coming out once a month. We also have lots of social media channels where we announce our events. If you're Northeastern faculty, you can apply for membership, be more active in participating with the center. We have bi-weekly brown bag lunches where we all get together and talk about interesting things, research. You can organize an event with us. There's a form on our website too for that. Finally, attend our events. This is just something that's events that are coming up. Well, the first one is what's happening today, but then we have next week our webinar series on the AI and the future of creative practice. Then we have our Spatializing Narrative 8, which is going to be an online event as well this year. In March, we have another episode of the AI webinar series, Gaming with Consciousness. We have a book talk by John Libby during Kennedy Day. And we're going to have, during Design Research Week, a workshop that me and my colleague Reagan Glover are doing about the history of mobile gaming, along with a tour that's going to be here of our mobile gaming collection. And finally, I forgot, because we still don't have posters for that, but we have a workshop from Jonah Booker Coyne, who's visiting us from NIU. That's going to be the Center for Design. And in April, we have another book talk from core faculty member Silke Mayer, and another AI webinar on AI influencers. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Claire Ogden. Claire is the Center Communication Specialist. She's responsible for doing our newsletter, all the social media channels, and keep our communication and promotion going. And she also organized our film screening series that's happening today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you all for coming today. I'm really excited to share this film, Your Opinion Please, with all of you. It's a really special film, and I first saw it at Globe Docs in the fall, which I think also Molly did. And it's just a really beautiful example of how local news can really foster community dialogue and deliberation about the issues that matter to us. So I think it's a really good jumping off point for a conversation about those things. Today we have a 14-minute film screening, and then it's going to be followed by a little panel discussion between Molly, the archivist at Northeastern, also Dan Kennedy, who's a professor in the School of Journalism, and Lily Cooper, who's with us from the Huntington News. And the Huntington News is also celebrating their centennial this year, so lots of interesting conversations about archives and looking back to look forward and all of that. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to start the film now, I think. Again, we're here with Molly Brown. She's the reference and outreach archivist at Northeastern, and she currently serves as co-chair of the Teaching with Primary Sources Roundtable for the New England Archivists. We're also sitting here with Lily Cooper. She's the campus editor for the Huntington News and a fourth-year biochemistry and journalism major. And to our right, Dan Kennedy is a professor in the School of Journalism and a nationally known media commentator. His most recent book, co-authored with Ellen Clegg, is called What Works in Community News: Media Startups, News Deserts, and the Future of the Fourth Estate. He also works with Ellen Clegg on a podcast called What Works, and it features interviews with leaders in the reinvention of community journalism. So just to kick things off, I think there's so much beautiful stuff, and like he said, the issues never change. There's so many issues that are kind of still with us today, and given your work with local news and community archives, what kind of stands out to you or resonates with you through the film?
I'll just go really quickly, and I think we'll have a chance to talk about my Montana connection a little later. But you know, in the archives, I think when we have our newspapers out, we have our gay community news issues, our Boston Phoenix issues, our East Boston community news issues. Everyone that gazes upon them feels almost this bittersweet resonance of the issues never change, and I think that there is both cyclical empowerment and a bit of cyclical disenfranchisement at times when you look at that and think, gosh, we really haven't gotten over this. But I think that we can see the ways that discourse changes about them and sort of the access points and the ability for uplift of certain voices and access to certain voices about them. So I think in the archives, that's what I see most, and that is what feels most poignant and really connects to what Marvin was saying. But I'll pass it over to our real deal news people to maybe continue that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so true that the issues that we're experiencing as students really haven't changed that much over the years. The world is a very different place, but looking through the archives, we're kind of still landing on the same topics. One thing that really I've noticed was, especially in like the 90s and the early 2000s, there's a lot of student activism. You see SGA advocating for marginalized student groups as they're doing now with international students. There's a lot of talk about the rise of the internet and how that's going to change learning, and I think now with like the rise of AI, we're kind of coming on that issue again. And it's just so interesting to see for our coverage how we covered things then and how that can inform us when we're covering them now. And also just to get context of like how things played out in the past, and it's really helpful for us.
Well, the film is certainly entertaining, I have to say. What struck me is that I felt like we were getting one half of what you need for real civic engagement, and that is you were hearing the voices of the community, and there is some value in that, especially the guy talking about poetry. I certainly got a kick out of him. But the other half, and we don't really have any sense of whether that other half exists, is a reliable source of news and information for that community. It's great that citizens are empowered to talk about anything that's on their minds, which is what this radio show did. But I was wondering whether there's anything that is helping to direct and organize that conversation around local news and concerns. We know that in places like Montana, it's especially difficult to start reliable news organizations. Rural America is where most of our news deserts are. And so what you have is people are especially attuned to national issues because they're not hearing much about local issues. And it really struck me that so many of the callers were talking about George W. Bush instead of their governor or their mayor or whatever. But it was certainly an interesting slice of life.
Yeah, totally. And I guess we're in this moment where the media landscape is, continuously fracturing more and more, and also like the rise of AI. And so I'm curious what you all think in terms of like how can we preserve community deliberation and discussion in this increasingly like isolated landscape? Kind of a tough question.
Yeah, I'll speak of this on the kind of preservation side especially. So we have access to these Your Opinion Please recordings because a teacher at Billings Senior High School recorded all of this on the radio and kept it himself, and then shared with Marshall and Lauren that they had their dad's recordings and would they be interested, and gosh, were they? So I mean, like, that is just like one citizen recording radio and keeping that accessibly, to be a public radio station and preserve all recordings. That's a spectrum of ability and is often regionalized rather than nationalized in terms of archiving methods. And I think, in the same way that at that time there was a lot of radio that people participated, there were a lot of call-in shows that people participated in. There's now an incredible proliferation of websites and forums and places where people are participating, and places in which news is expressed on social media, news in which is expressed on many proprietary platforms. So certainly archivists are attuned to this and trying to address different aspects of digital preservation, trying to address different aspects of how do we offboard something off of one platform, such as like if it's in your Google Drive or if it's in your Instagram, what does that look like to preserve for the next 5 years, which is kind of all we reasonably can try to do with digital materials, and we try to keep doing that onward. So I think that we still look to community members to, put a website that you want to access again in the Internet Archive, use the Wayback Machine, leverage that for sites that you want to keep. Archivists are out there and they're mobilized, but there are only so many of us, and so we need people with a commitment to future access, also looking at things critically.
Yeah, I think local news is a really useful way to keep having these conversations, and especially at Hunt News, we always encourage people to write either op-eds, letters to the editor, and I think just pushing that and encouraging students to get involved and use the news not only as a way to receive local news, but also to give your input and kind of uplift all of your voices. I think that's something that we've been really trying to push recently, because yeah, we are an outlet, but also we want to hear from people and we want to hear what you guys have to say. And so I think just encouraging conversation either through those ways, or even just like starting a conversation on one of our Instagram posts, commenting something, saying how you feel. Even that can just spark a discourse that can be really interesting, especially when we're all students, we all go here, we're all interested in the same issues, and I think it's a great opportunity for everyone to participate and make their voice heard.
Claire, do you know if this program is still on the air?
I think not, yeah. I think it was
not.
between 1997 and 2007 that it was live.
Okay. I mean, it's hard to imagine programming that costs less than this. So, but there's nothing wrong with that. But I find myself wondering, why did they cancel it? Do you know?
I'm actually not sure, although that's maybe a good segue to talking about Molly. So Molly's actually from this area, from Montana.
Do you know Molly?
Yeah, I can. So I think part of it was that Marvin was retiring, and there were different cuts for different programs. But I think that it was mostly that this was a program that was really run by Marvin Granger and Ken Siebert, and at the time there was a shift in programming, and Marvin was moving on, was retiring from KEMC. So I think primarily it was that there was kind of a big personality behind it.
Yeah.
But I will also say, to your point too, of like, what does the other sides like? Where is the civic conversation? I think that what Your Opinion Please ended up doing, especially in Montana, where NPR was kind of considered like the liberal media, this was something that people were hesitant to engage with, a bit distrustful about. It really felt like they weren't being heard or weren't being seen in what they viewed as a liberal echo chamber. So Your Opinion Please allowed them to kind of be heard, to offer a place where there aren't people that are going to retract immediately from your opinion. They're going to give you a space to hear it out. And so it kind of was a good gateway for people to getting more trust in KEMC, getting more trust in like the Yellowstone Public Radio and then Greater Montana Public Radio. But I think that it, with it being a live call program where people were immediately transferred into, even though it was, you were getting a lot of programming and thoughts for free from people calling in, it was incredibly laborious in the radio station to, make sure that the calls were going through, to, there were no screeners, but you also had to be incredibly attuned if somebody was going to say something that had to be shut off. And so it required maybe more people in the booth in your public radio station that were really on it than maybe other shows might.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I would point out about this is that this was a public radio show, and you talk about the fact that it was perceived as being liberal. But the other thing about this that I think is important is that public radio is also perceived as being civil. And you think about the kind of talk radio that we've all been exposed to from time to time, where you have a host who's just yelling at everybody and callers are calling in expressing belligerent views about one thing or another. This is very different than that, and it's much more valuable than that to listen to those voices. I think that there are a variety of ways to do this. Certainly, and unfortunately, we don't see an awful lot of people watching local access channels on cable TV, but they almost always have programs that are kind of like this, where you have somebody from the community hosting a show where people can call in and express themselves. I don't mean to be repetitive, but I really think that I'd really like to see how a local news organization can facilitate this conversation. There are many ways to do that, everything from having the news organization having a Facebook page to showing up at every farmer's market and just meeting people. But I think that that's a crucial part of this too.
Yeah, so I do also want to shout out that we have a lot of different archives of community papers here. So Molly's brought microfilm readers with the Huntington News Archives, and also Lily Cooper from the Huntington News. They're having their 100th year anniversary, their centennial this year. Yeah, so Molly, do you want to just talk about what you've brought and what you have here?
Yeah, so what I brought is probably our most our archive safe version of materials that we can interact with when we have beverages and food out. So we have the microfilm, the Northeastern News, which we have microfilm of copies of versions of Northeastern News from 1917 when it started as the Tech and was very oriented towards its engineering students, and it also had a business newspaper. But then in 1926, the Tech and Northeastern News merged to become one newspaper so that they could address all of the students on campus. But what's on the reel right now is kind of 1970s campus newspapers, so just roughly 50 years ago, to kind of divide that centennial in half. But I would say too, I encourage everyone to check out the archives that we have in other collections. So we're located in the lower level of Snow Library. And as I was watching this, I was really thinking about the Gay Community News, which is a newspaper started in 1973 by 8 LGBTQA individuals at the Charles Street Meeting House, which then grew into being a regional newspaper and then a national newspaper. So to start from like an 8-person led newsletter to go into a newspaper, I think is a nice way of seeing like what's possible of starting these conversations, what's possible of starting small and growing. And a colleague that's in the audience, Irene Gates, is currently processing one of the reporter's papers, Nancy Walker. And Nancy Walker, kind of in the spectrum of the Gay Community News authors, was considered somewhat moderate, right? She wasn't as radical as some of them. She was a little more towards the center, and there is so much interesting correspondence to her and letters to the editor about her and with her, and just thinking about the sort of ownership that we see in the Gay Community News from the readership. Often they were writing to critique what was in the news. They were writing to say, you were not inclusive enough here, or I really hated how you portrayed this community. Could we find like a way to broaden this perspective? And there was kind of, it's not that we were in a perfect monoculture at the time, right, in the 1970s either. People still had other ways to get distinct news that was siloed for their different kind of community perspective. But there was a sense of ownership in the news and civic participation that felt really unique, where people were giving feedback and that was heard. And there was sort of almost a trust that if this feedback is being issued, then it will be processed in some sort of manner and addressed. And not saying that that doesn't happen now, but it's just something that's kind of remarkable to witness as it happens in our other community newspapers.
Yeah, totally. And Lily, I'm wondering, like, how does the Huntington News, how are you approaching this centennial? Like, are there any moments from their history or moments from your present day of being a campus editor where these issues kind of come up for you and anything that resonated with you from the film?
It's a good question. I think, just the way the presenter's demeanor was so interesting. I think he did such a good job of staying open, encouraging people to give their opinions, even if maybe sometimes they were less informed, like the poetry guy. Instead of kind of making fun of him, he gave him the space to kind of express the fact that he didn't know much about poetry. He laughed along with people, and he very much diffused the tension, especially when talking about issues that were kind of big or scary or very divisive. And I think that's important in our university community. I think there's a lot of things happening right now. Our campus is pretty divided, maybe not politically, but on issues like Israel-Palestine, for example, there's been a lot of kind of activism and division on campus. And I think just taking the time to understand the other side and hear people out and really go in with the opinion that somebody with a different view than you isn't necessarily wrong or malicious. They just are looking at a thing in a different way. I think that's really helpful, and yeah.
And I know that, I've seen some of those recent posts about, especially I think I saw an op-ed last month that was about anti-Semitism and Palestine and stuff. And I guess I'm wondering, just from your perspective, like, how do you handle those conversations in a way that like welcomes the others' opinions and welcomes community feedback, while also kind of preserving like a sense of civility and I mean, you're student journalists, like you can't address everything all the time.
Yeah, I mean, like general rule obviously is if anyone has an opinion that they want to offer, it's welcome. In a reported piece, it's a little more difficult because people feel very strongly about things, and sometimes it's hard to convey that emotion while also sticking to the facts. But I think on the whole, speaking to our student community, people are very willing to hear from others. And I mean, a couple months ago, I interviewed a few Jewish students about the conflict and about the ceasefire, and they were all actually very moderate and very, like, they just expressed the fact that they were just happy that the conflict was over. They weren't really holding on anger towards the other side. And especially one guy said to me, in the beginning, he was very angry, and he just didn't know what to think or where to turn, and then he decided that he would try to read outlets that were pushing forward a message that was very different from what he believed. And from doing that, he actually let go of that sense of anger, and he was able to just look at the conflict as horrible for both sides, and he just wanted it to be over. And so I think that's what's most important, just as long as people are willing to hear others out and to look at alternative media outlets, I think we're able to have a pretty mature conversation.
One thing I will say is that I think the Huntington News' coverage of the Israel-Palestinian conflict on campus has just been superb going back several years. It's really just been a great place to go for a calm and understanding take on what both sides are thinking, and it's really been great.
Totally. Yeah, does anyone have any questions about anything we've discussed?
So you were going to ask me about comments. Do you still
Oh
want to
yeah.
ask us?
You've been, I've taken your class. I'm a master's student in the journalism program here, in addition to my work as a staff member, and I just remember you being very opinionated about the online comments feature for certain newspapers, like just offering that as an option if people want to weigh in about coverage, and also questions about like how does that get moderated? How do we make sure it's no hate speech is happening there, and also protecting the First Amendment?
I was around when comments were born. This would have been 30 years ago at this point. And I think that when that happened, we all had the belief that, we're going to have a dialogue with the public and it's going to be wonderful. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that people who tend to gravitate to news comment sections bring a lot of anger and sociopathy to the table. So I've really come to believe that a comment section can be valuable, but only if you're screening every comment before it goes up. And almost no one does that. A news organization that I have followed for years called the New Haven Independent screens every comment before it's published. And the problem with allowing racist, homophobic, misogynistic comments to go up and then only taking them down later is that, they made it up and people saw them. And that ends up harming any attempt at having a community conversation. You really have to do it ahead of time. I've also found that offloading the comments to some of the platforms, as much as we may not like them, actually has a good distancing quality to it, so that the news organization itself isn't necessarily thought to have endorsed everything that goes up. So a lot of news organizations, especially at the local level, have continued to find that Facebook is a valuable tool. Now you may say, nobody under 50 ever looks at Facebook, and you're probably right. But the local news audience in general tends to be older anyway. So Facebook ends up working for them. So comments have been, it's a complicated story. It isn't nearly as positive as we thought it would be when we were starting down the road, but I still think that it is valuable. And I have to say, I used to write a weekly column for GBH News, one of the big public broadcasters in Boston. I wrote a column for their website. And at one point, they switched their content management system. For some reason, they never seemed to switch to a good one, but they kept switching CMSs. And during one of those switches, they just eliminated comments. And you know what? I don't think anybody complained.
Yeah. Any parting thoughts about the Huntington News Centennial, Lily? Like, how has that been? And I know you're not super involved with that process, but I'd just love to hear a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a really interesting time to be at the news, and I've loved being here during the Centennial because, I mean, it's exciting for all of us on the news right now, but it's also just like a great opportunity to honor all of our alumni, everyone who's ever worked on the paper. We've been building an alumni network, and through that, we're getting to meet lots of people who've worked on the news over the years, and that's just so cool to see the people who've brought us from the print days all the way through the digital age, and everyone who's kind of got us where we are today. And I think it just reaffirms why we're doing what we're doing. It's not just for right now, but it's also to kind of continue on this legacy of all the people who've worked on the paper over the years. So I think, yeah, it's really exciting to be working on the paper right now, and it's a good time, yeah.
Hi. Molly, I have a quick question. So you lived where this radio show was serving, the community it was serving. So was there other newspapers, like Dan was asking, like going on, or was this like just had its own radio frequency and was just running on that?
Yeah, so this, the radio station that they were recording out of was KEMC, which is on a college campus and was a part of like the wider NPR public radio network. There are other newspapers in Billings, Montana, which is where it was based out of at the time. And I think those, like, they definitely had spaces for conversation. I think there were columnists which similarly engaged people in the way that Marvin engaged them through radio. But I think that this was just one where people had even more chance to call in. But there were a ton of community newspapers, and I think those are a little more fledgling now due to different larger companies buying them out and due to kind of different economical constraints. But yeah, it was in a lot of other local public radio stations too. It would be played for them as well, which is why you hear like Livingston and Bozeman and Helena, other towns.
Yeah. This is a pretty niche poll for you. Like, you're an archive reporter, and it's from your hometown.
Yeah,
so,
it is.
cool.
It's a pretty sweet twist of fate. So I grew up 5 minutes from the radio station where this was done. Marshall Granger, who was the director, Lauren Granger, the director of photography. I did community theater with them, grew up with them. My family has Thanksgiving with them. So it's a close deal here. So I am a bit of an insider, but I also think that it was really interesting because this was when I was pretty young too. So this was a radio show that was on when I was a kid that people really had fun with, that called in with, and Marvin was just somebody that you'd see about town that everybody would come up to and chat with. So it's interesting. But yeah,
cool.
Sweet niche pull for me, for sure.
Speaking of a very niche pull, I'm a very big fan of Dan from the Friday Beat the Press, Emily Rooney days, so it's good to see him first time today. I didn't know you had a podcast, I'll check it out. But when it comes to, you mentioned the, talk radio, non-public talk radio, it's a little more, obviously bombastic historically, and I'm old enough to remember I was in middle school when the Air America experiment failed, of course, and I'm wondering, especially now that it's translated to, I was 80% of, private, right, talk radio seems to lean conservative-ish historically, and now it's translated to podcasts and influencer media as well, where the biggest names and the biggest following are on the right side of the spectrum, sometimes, all right. And I'm wondering Dan's opinion on the connection between that, how it's sort of translated, why that is in both cases, both with radio historically, the last 40 years, and with social media and podcast influencers now. I'm sure Dan may know the exact term, but it is the vast majority of people with the biggest followers are not liberal or progressive in any way. I just want to, just general thoughts on that sort of subject and the changes.
I think that the predominance of right-leaning voices on talk radio is something that's very important. And it's not something that I can do a particularly good job of putting my finger on. I tend to think that the type of format that we hear on right-wing talk radio is just something that doesn't appeal to people on the left. If you had the left-leaning equivalent of that, I don't think it would do well. And I don't think it's because liberals are better, but I just think that they tend to gravitate to different types of media. You look at the enormous audience for the signature news programs on NPR. Now, I would dispute the notion that NPR news coverage is wildly liberal, but nevertheless, it caters to liberal sensibilities, and probably most of the listeners tend to be liberal. So maybe that's the true way of thinking about it. The right has gravitated to talk radio and increasingly to podcasts, and the left has gravitated to things like NPR. It may be no accident now that the Trump administration has targeted public broadcasting for defunding, so that stations like Yellowstone Public Radio are now really struggling to stay alive. And I'm sure that they're really struggling because the NPR itself gets most of its money from donations and foundations and things like that. Large public stations, such as those in Boston, are having some trouble, but they'll get through it. It's the smaller outlets especially in urban communities of color and in rural areas that are really in danger of going under. And so it's unfortunate that this medium that has tended to be very popular among more liberal trending listeners and viewers is now under assault from the very government that they're trying to hold to account. There certainly are some very popular liberal-leaning podcasts, maybe nothing like some of the ones on the right, but I think there's a little bit more balance there, and certainly this explosion of newsletters, most of them on Substack, it started off as kind of a right-wing phenomenon, and I think in the last couple of years it has trended toward the left.
Great. I think we'll end it there. Thank you all so much for coming, and be sure to grab some snacks on your way out. Visit Molly's microphone reader and pick up a copy of the Huntington News. So yeah, thank you so much. And we have an event feedback form as well, so if you could fill that out, that'd be great.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.